All right, well, welcome to the forum. I'm Josh Cowan. Thrilled to be here today with somebody I've been wanting to connect with for a while to talk about some of the different things going on in Washington today. Sam Bagenstos is an attorney, professor of law at the University of Michigan, has a lot of other experience that I'm going to ask him to talk about in just a second. For folks starting to listen to this or reading through this on the transcript, just some housekeeping pieces. Check out our last conversation with Congresswoman Kristen McDonald-Rivet, covering all kinds of things, including federal education policy. Next week, we'll be talking to another member of Congress from outside the state of Michigan, also federal education policy. And right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the federal administrative and regulatory state with somebody who really knows this inside and out. Sam Bagenstos, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me.
So it's going to be a bio in the show notes for folks listening who want to go check that out. But um, tell me a little bit about kind of your legal professional background. Set us up where that began to connect formally to some of the government service pieces that we're going to talk about here in a second.
Yeah, for sure. So, as you said, I currently teach at the University of Michigan. I've been on the faculty there since about 2008, but I have taken a couple of leaves to serve in the federal government since my time there. I was, during the Obama administration, the principal deputy assistant attorney general for civil rights at the Department of Justice. So, in a leadership position there. And then for the entire Biden administration, I was on leave. I spent the first year and a half, starting at the moment of inauguration, as general counsel at the Office of Management and Budget. And then in June of 22, I moved over to the Department of Health and Human Services, where I was the general counsel until pretty much the end. So that's the work I've done. I continue to do a lot of work relating to the government, although not in the government at this point.
As somebody who really works pretty closely with policymakers in states and to some extent the federal government, I can't overstate how important the jobs that you just described are. What's kind of a nuts and bolts piece of that before we get into some of the specifics? Like what's the portfolio look like across kind of some of these agencies?
Yeah, I mean, so they're all sort of different. The probably the widest portfolio I ever had was working at the Office of Management and Budget. So that OMB is the sort of nerve center of the federal executive branch. They're the folks who make sure that all of the agencies across the executive branch are doing what the president wants, consistent with the law. And we'll talk a little bit about that balance in a minute, I'm sure. And so, what that meant was my responsibility as the general counsel for that agency in the White House was everything that the executive branch did. So I didn't know whether I'd be walking in and, dealing with some environmental issue or, obviously COVID was a huge issue when we started, or evacuating folks from Afghanistan was a thing we had to deal with. But it was literally anything that was going on in the federal government was something I dealt with. Um, Super fun, and the legality of all of those issues. And so a lot, that was every regulation across the federal government, making sure it was checked to be consistent with administrative law. All of our spending, the drafting of major legislation like the COVID recovery bills, the American Rescue Plan, and the other bills that President Biden did. At HHS, sort of similar job, but narrower scope. But I will say the Department of Health and Human Services is the largest cabinet department by budget. So it was about $1.73 trillion when I was there. And, about 40% of the regulations issued by the federal executive branch come from HHS. So it was, again, just a very wide ambit. At the Department of Justice, earlier in my career, it was much more focused on bringing enforcement actions to make sure that civil rights laws were complied with. So, bringing and threatening lawsuits around the country, negotiating agreements with states and localities and businesses to make sure they complied.
All right, so HHS, OMB, DOJ, you've been at these various agencies under different administrations. They are in the news constantly right now. Um, what 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 should we be most concerned about kind of as we're looking at what's going on? And if you want to take it across all three, if you want to just talk about one, whatever you want. But like what kind of looking at this, we'll get into some of the details here in a second, but just kind of at a bird's eye level.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the highest level, the most important thing that's going on is you have this pervasive effort to transform the federal executive branch into something that's not implementing laws and policies enacted by Congress in an impartial way, but instead is using the tools of government as a weapon to serve the interests not just of a political party and not just of a faction within the political party, but of a person and the people around him. So we have this pervasive weaponization, politicization, and personalization of the government around Donald Trump and the folks around him, and the use of every tool of government to reward the friends of Donald Trump and punish the enemies of Donald Trump. That is the absolute antithesis of what a good government or a Republican government should be. So that's at the highest level. We can talk about what that means for particular policies and actions, but that's the most important takeaway.
So let's get into, I want to ask about this kind of, what we would call in my line of work kind of the administrative or regulatory state here. And outside advocacy groups, including in the education space, we're doing all of my work, a lot of listeners in the education space, but not exclusively there. Um, Focus maybe understandably on legislation, to some extent on kind of just very clear executive order too. These kind of big high profile things get a lot of attention, get a lot of fight. But what Trump's doing has been uh, often, I don't know what the percentage is, but often really inside some of the things that you're talking about here, kind of this kind of more subtle, um, uh, I would again call it sort of in the administrative or regulatory side of things, legally in some cases, maybe not in others, or often not in others. Can you talk about some of the specific kind of non-legislative tools that have been deployed here to kind of to kind of reward and punish, as you're saying, and maybe one that's patently illegal as in your judgment as a lawyer, but then also maybe something that, because there's a lot of spaces here where there's some legal question, there's some sort of, right, is it how do we interpret this kind of thing that they're trying to do here? Like, what are some of the ways that we kind of can look at these activities that are, either patently illegal or in the best case scenario, plainly abusive?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think there are a few obvious ones to talk about here. And, you know, let me start just because you started with education, what Donald Trump is doing to the Department of Education. So what you have is a department that was created by Congress. You have provisions adopted in appropriations bills by Congress that say you can't eliminate the Department of Education, Mr. President. We are continuing to fund it and we are barring you from eliminating it. And yet, what you have is this dismantlement of the department done entirely through administrative processes. So, what they're doing is essentially farming out as many of the responsibilities of the Department of Education as they can to other agencies. And they have, legal tools that they point to there. So there's a tool called the Economy Act. I worked with this a lot at the Office of Management and Budget, which is basically if one agency has a responsibility to do something but doesn't have the ability to do it, it can contract with another agency to do it. And so what they've done is said, aha, Department of Education is just going to contract with the Department of Health and Human Services to do all the disability work. It's going to contract with the Department of Labor to do job training work. It's going to contract with the Department of Treasury to do all the student loan work. And pretty soon you have no Department of Education at all. And so that's, taking this existing legal tool that you can see a use for it in particular cases, using it in a way no one could ever have imagined. And, I think that's abusive. I think there's a plausible argument that that's illegal. It's certainly inconsistent with the judgment made by our elected representatives that we are supposed to have a Department of Education, that it's good for the people to have a Department of Education. Okay, so that's one thing. take something that's much more abusive, maybe, and it's certainly much more in the nature of rewarding friends, punishing enemies, and also much more clearly illegal. So, one of the things we've seen this whole administration do is use its power over money and particularly grant funding or federally funded programs that where the money goes to states and localities and other entities, use that as a tool to attack people who are on the bad side of Donald Trump for whatever reason, right? I mean, we actually, we're recording this on Wednesday. We just saw yesterday the federal government say they're going to withhold an enormous amount, I think $1 billion of Medicaid funds from 2 states. That all seems to be about punishing them because they're blue states. We've seen lots of funding cutoffs that are all about punishing blue states, punishing them supposedly for violating terms and conditions of agreements, but violating them in ways that red states are probably doing the same thing and are not getting the same treatment. We've seen the shutting off of funds to institutions of higher education to force them to come to heel. I mean, look at what happened to Columbia, which ultimately did knuckle under. Look at what happened to Brown University, which did knuckle under. Harvard sued and actually prevailed in its lawsuit that these threats were unlawful. The University of California was going to negotiate a settlement with the Trump administration, but the faculty and faculty unions got together and filed a preemptive lawsuit, and the court said that what the Trump administration was doing was unlawful there. And what they're doing is saying, look, you're a university, you depend on hundreds of millions of dollars a year of federal funding for research programs. We're going to cut that off until you do exactly what we want. This is plainly abusive and a violation of law. But there are so many of these examples where what the Trump administration is doing is using the tools it has to cut off federal funds, to investigate or threaten investigations or prosecutions in order to coerce people to do their bidding and in order to punish people who seem to be on the wrong side of the administration for reasons having nothing to do with the laws that are being enforced.
Let me just ask you quickly about the grant piece of this. Because, OMB is reviewing this thing called Uniform Grant Guidance, something you're aware of, it's something I'm aware of. It's basically sort of bureaucracy speak for specifically they're trying to look for ways to hold back funding. And there's different types of grant funding in this space. And there's a particular type of danger here in what they're trying to do with some types or what they're kind of rolling out in terms of the uniform piece of this. It's one of the potential changes. I think it's illegal. You seem to think so too. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that could really fundamentally alter the federal relationship to education. There's a whole bunch of other things going on too. But can you just walk us through this particular piece, this uniform grant guidance, what they're trying to do mechanically and why you think it's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, so there are across the entire federal government many, many programs that Congress has created to give grants to various entities. Sometimes it's for scientific or medical research from NIH or National Science Foundation. Sometimes it's for job training, which could be from the Department of Education or Department of Labor. Sometimes it's for programs to support education from the Department of Education. Anywhere, housing programs, any kind of program, you name it. And what this uniform grants guidance would do is it would adopt a uniform grants regulation would do is it would replace what we have now, which is a general set of guidance for each agency to make its own rules with a single uniform set of rules that govern all the grants. And, uniformity, you can have some arguments, is that good or bad? The problem is the specific rules that would be adopted, which would do things like, say, peer review can only be advisory, and any grant determination, whether to issue a grant and to whom, has to be made by a political appointee, and has to be made by a political appointee according to what demonstrably advances the president's priorities. Now, Congress has created a whole bunch of very specific grant programs to serve various kinds of interests and to pursue various goals, which may not be the president's goals. In fact, we know they're not the president's goals. Congress has specifically required peer review for grants from some agencies like NIH and NSF, where what we're trying to do is advance the science. And so we want the scientific community to have a significant amount of control over where those grants go. That's I think illegal. It's flying in the face of a congressional determination, and it's likely to lead to less development of knowledge and less development of useful knowledge, right? So it's going to harm the public. It's going to mean people are going to die. People aren't going to learn as much. I mean, it's really very serious stuff. Also, there's a set of forbidden topics in this rule that says, we can't be financing quote unquote gender ideology, which means, saying that LGBTQ people should be treated equally and with respect. We can't finance quote unquote illegal DEI, which is a term that this administration throws around that it's never been clear what they mean by it, except efforts to promote equality on the basis of race or sex, that grants should not be used to promote illegal immigration. Again, nobody is using grants to actually pay for people to cross the border illegally. Promote illegal immigration seems to be used in a way that's like to flag people talking about the value of immigrants, however they came into this country, to their communities. So that's a major concern. And then there's also a very significant concern about adding a provision that would say that grants can be terminated at any time if they no longer serve the policy goals of the incumbent administration, which means if you get a multi-year grant, to conduct a study that's going to take 5, 6, 7 years, you have to purchase a lot of infrastructure, you have to hire a lot of people. All of those investments can end up just in the garbage can at the whim of a political appointee who decides, yeah, politically, I don't like where this study is going. Again, just deeply contrary to the idea of developing knowledge, and to what Congress has repeatedly voted for. So it's deeply contrary to our Republican democracy, where we don't have one person who decides. We elect a set of representatives who pass laws, and the president has a duty to faithfully execute those laws.
So let me ask you, you've covered a little bit of what I meant in this, just a couple more questions about what I meant in this one. But let me ask about one person. You know, one of the things that I hear a lot about when I talk to policymakers, particularly those that are trying to think about what's coming next with the federal government, is literally something on the order of, well, we don't trust Ross Vogt not to say he doesn't like something and hold something back. Just very specific to this person, in part because of what happened, I think, in January of 2025 with the new administration coming in, this temporary pause on funding that happened, freaked everybody out. Seems like a lifetime ago, but
Hmm.
what, what are some of the stipulating that this administration doesn't seem at all to care about systems and processes, let alone legality, but what is the specific kind of guardrail? What am I getting at here? Sort of, it really does seem to be right now that a lot of this comes down to what this particular person thinks, or a handful of people that work directly in that office, that you would have had a lot of contact with that office structurally in your time there in the Biden administration. Like, what is the lever that they're trying to pull there at OMB to just like stop funding they just don't like? And they're doing it in lots of different places. We just talked about the grant guidance stuff, but like, what is going on there in terms of like this one individual? We hear a lot more about Stephen Miller. We hear about people within the White House specifically. What about the OMB director?
Yeah, I mean, Russ Vought, the OMB director, is, I think, one of the most significant figures in this administration. And he is significant because, A, he's totally bought into the Trump approach to the world, and B, he is very, very smart and skilled with moving the bureaucracy. And so it's that combination that is incredibly dangerous here. He knows, I mean, he was OMB director during Trump's first term, at least toward the end, as well as working in the White House before that. And he's been around Washington a long time. He understands the levers to pull. And the most important lever that the Office of Management and Budget has is that it controls the purse strings. So the B part of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, is really, really important. No agency can spend a dollar of the money that Congress has appropriated until OMB signs something called an apportionment. And what Russ, and this is like incredibly wonky stuff nobody knows about. And what Russ Vogt knows is that that is the crucial lever for making agencies do what you want to do. And, in a well-run administration, what would happen, and an administration that cares about good government, what would happen is the apportionment power would be used as a tool to make sure the agency had a good plan for spending the money. The whole reason it's there is so agencies don't spend too much too quickly, but are spending prudently, and spending efficiently. And so you'd have a conversation, then you'd sign off and say, okay, go ahead, spend the money, or spend this quarter's amount of money and come back to me in a couple of months for next quarter. And what Vote has done pervasively is use it to drill down to the most specific decisions and say, I'm not going to sign off on this unless you hammer these people and reward these other people. I'm not going to sign off on. I mean, one of the things we're seeing him do now, and the pattern is very clear, is the president sends up to Congress a budget every year. That budget is not legally binding. That's the president's proposal. Congress has the power of the purse under our Constitution. Congress adopts a budget through a law. They pass a budget resolution and then they pass appropriations laws. And those laws are binding on the president. And the president cannot refuse to spend money that Congress has passed through an appropriations law, which of course the president has signed. But what we're seeing now is where Congress appropriates money that goes beyond what was in the president's budget request. What Russ Vogt is doing is just saying to the agencies, you may not spend beyond the president's budget request. And so he's effectively treating Congress as having adopted the budget that they explicitly refused to adopt. And so this is creating problems over and over and over again. And again, it's harmful to effective governance. And it's also fundamentally anti-democratic. I mean, there is a long and unfortunately bloody history that led to the legislature taking the power of the purse, first from the King of England, and then that carried over to our founding. And, what we're seeing right now is reversing that in favor of allowing one man, Donald Trump, and his one man by his side, Russ Vogt, to make these decisions.
You are your expertise and experiences in really high demand right now. You're all over the podcast circuit. I see you on socials commenting on things. What have you not been asked here or elsewhere? Like what get something off your chest that the good governance, the policy community should be thinking about moving forward?
Well, I think the thing people are thinking about too little is, we obviously, let's hope, are going to have a new day at some point where we're going to be in a position to rebuild what's been torn down. And everybody knows that that's going to be a very difficult effort. I think people are dramatically underestimating the scale of what's going to be necessary. That it's not just going to be, okay, that was a thing that happened those last 4 years. Let's go back to normal. There is not going to be a normal anymore. In order to rebuild the government, we're going to have to, unfortunately, spend a lot more money than we would have expected because, again, we have to rehire people who have left government service, often because they were forced out, are not going to come back on the same terms as they did before. The reason why people serve in government jobs and career civil service jobs, I mean, two reasons. One, they know that it's a mission-focused job, and two, they know it has stability. And what we've learned in two successive Trump administrations is that we're one election away from losing both of those aspects of the public service bargain. And so we're going to have to do something to entice people to come back. That's going to be expensive. That's going to be hard. That's going to require rethinking a whole lot about the way the government works. And I think people just need to get their minds around just how difficult a position we're in. Now, I know there are a lot of people who are working very hard now to be prepared and who will be ready to jump in, but it's going to be an enormous task.
Well, whatever that looks like, I know you'll be part of that rebuild. I hope you will. Let's check back in at some point next few months, see how everything's going. Sam Bagenstos, thanks so much for spending some time this morning.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.